Imagine this. You wake up at 2:13 a.m., the room blue with phone glow, the ceiling fan beating a dull metronome to the worry in your chest. Your mouth is dry. Your thoughts are louder than the night. You reach for something, anything, to quiet the storm. It could be a cigarette, a drink, a dating app, a gaming controller, a bag of chips, a work email, the same toxic conversation you promised you'd never start again. You don't call it addiction. You call it taking the edge off, being productive, just one more, I deserve this, I can stop whenever. You are both the prison and the locksmith, and every key you try turns into another lock. You tell yourself you chase pleasure, but pleasure is a small and skittish animal that bolts as soon as your hand approaches. What you're really chasing is a silence so deep, it feels like a home you lost before you had words. The paradox begins here. You reach for relief and wake up farther from yourself. You seek comfort and become estranged from your own body. You aim for control and end up negotiating with cravings that speak with your voice but never ask your permission. Imagine how quickly the world helps you rename your need. Weakness, lack of discipline, moral failure. How neat those labels look on the shelf of public opinion, how badly they fit the shape of your pain. If you are praised for your productivity, your addiction won a prize. If you are punished for your relapse, your addiction won again. Either way, the story is written without you. An object to be corrected, a problem to be managed, a cautionary tale with your face cut out of it. But here's the splinter under the skin of every familiar explanation. If addiction were simply about the substance, why do you feel the same compulsion with behaviors you can't pour into a glass or crush into a powder? Why do screens, love, shopping, fasting, scrolling, praise, or high-performance living produce the same haunted rhythm in your nervous system? Why does just stop sound reasonable at noon and like a cruel joke at midnight? Consider this unsettling frame. What if the addiction is not your enemy, but your body's last-ditch attempt to protect you? What if the bottle, the binge, the endless workday, the risky thrill, what if each is a makeshift shelter thrown up in a storm that started long before you could name the weather? If so, then the classic question, why the addiction, turns itself inside out into the question that actually matters. Why the pain? You feel the words land like a small earthquake. Why the pain? It doesn't accuse you. It turns toward you. It implies there is something to be understood rather than merely condemned. That thought frightens you because it means stepping into a territory where blame loses its edge and responsibility gets heavier. It suggests your habits are maps of places you've been exiled from. Safety, belonging, dignity. The ordinary peace of an unguarded breath. Imagine walking into a crowded room where everyone is performing, even when they're alone. The culture makes it easy to call dependence lifestyle, to baptize compulsion as hustle, to lacquer emptiness with novelty and call it thriving. You sense the absurdity and yet can't opt out. You notice how convenience sedates, how stimulation counterfeits intimacy, how numbness masquerades as strength. The reward pathways in your brain learn a single prayer. Again. Your calendar becomes a shrine to next time. You live in a city whose currency is distraction and whose one unforgivable sin is stillness. You start to suspect that what you crave isn't the thing, but the moment right before it, the brief suspension, of dread when your finger hovers over the purchase button, the hush before the first sip touches your tongue, the bright click as the notification blooms. That small instant when the future narrows into one simple instruction and your fractured attention is finally, mercifully, unified. For a heartbeat you are free from choice. Then the moment passes and the search begins again, hungrier. What kind of wound requires a ritual like that? What would you have to feel if you didn't reach? What memory wakes up when you stop moving? What would it mean to consider your addiction not as a shameful anomaly, but as an overheated alarm system, malfunctioning, yes, but designed for one honest purpose, to keep you from drowning in something your body believes is deadly? There is a reason this question threatens the neat arithmetic of good habits versus bad habits. It implies history. It implies relationship. It implies a nervous system calibrated by experiences you didn't choose and stories you learned to carry like armor. It implies that the roots of all addiction may be tangled in the same soil where your earliest need for love, safety, and recognition either bloomed or withered. So you pause. Not because you have an answer, but because the question itself has turned sacred. What is the pain my habit is trying to solve? What shape does it have? Who handed it to me? How have I kept it alive by misunderstanding it? And if the habit is a solution, however costly, what does it say about the problem it was built to solve? Hold that question gently. Don't rush it into confession or verdict. Let it unsettle your certainty, the way a storm remakes the coastline. Because beneath the surface explanations, willpower, morality, genetics as destiny, another story is waiting. One that speaks the language of attachment and absence, of stress and memory, of culture and meaning. Follow that thread, and you may find yourself in a place both dangerous and liberating, the origin of your hunger. Now step with me into the hidden room behind the behavior, the place where psychology, philosophy and society collude, and watch how the root system reveals itself. Beneath every craving lies a question too painful to ask directly. What am I missing that this moment promises to replace? Gabor Maté often says that addiction is not the disease. It is the symptom, a desperate attempt to soothe the ache of disconnection. To understand that ache, you must trace it backward through layers of memory and meaning, past the chemical and the behavioral, down to the ancient human need to feel safe in the world and loved for existing. Imagine the infant who cries and no one comes. The nervous system learns a lesson long before words. The world does not respond when I am in pain. The body, small and defenseless, begins to hold its breath. Over time, that child grows, learns language, goes to school, builds a career. But the body never forgets the first equation it solved. Pain equals isolation. It will spend decades trying to disprove it. Every addiction is an experiment in rewriting that formula. Dr. Maté observes this in his patients who use heroin, alcohol, work, or relationships to self-medicate a wound that is older than any syringe or bottle. Their dependency isn't proof of moral weakness, but evidence of adaptation. The substance or behavior becomes the surrogate parent that never leaves, the chemical lullaby that finally says, "You can rest now." In this sense, the addict is not weaker than others. They are simply more honest about their suffering. They cannot pretend to be okay under the weight of a world that celebrates numbness as strength. Carl Jung, who mapped the psyche like an archaeologist of the soul, would have called this wound the unintegrated shadow, those rejected emotions, unmet needs and unacknowledged fears that operate beneath awareness. Jung wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Addiction, viewed through his lens, is the shadow's rebellion against silence. The more the conscious mind denies pain, the louder the shadow screams through compulsion. Nietzsche saw the same drama in different language. He spoke of resentment, a festering energy born from suppressed vitality, where life's instincts turn inward and poison themselves. The addict's cycle mirrors this perfectly. Desire turned against itself, pleasure weaponized into punishment. Nietzsche's solution was not moral restraint, but transformation of energy, to confront the chaos directly, to dance with the abyss until it becomes creation. But that requires courage rare in a world that rewards conformity and punishes introspection. Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher of tragic clarity, believed all human striving arises from a blind, restless will that can never be satisfied. Desire by its nature guarantees suffering. The addict simply reveals what civilization conceals, that our compulsions are universal, differing only in form. Society applauds the workaholic, the consumer, the influencer, each feeding on endless desire while pretending its purpose. The alcoholic is merely more transparent. Schopenhauer would say the rest of us are addicted to distraction itself. Aldous Huxley foresaw this in Brave New World, where people escape anxiety not through rebellion, but through soma, a perfect pleasure drug that erases pain and meaning in one dose. Today's soma glows in blue light, refreshes every second and fits in your pocket. It trains attention to flicker rather than focus, emotion to react rather than reflect. What we call progress may, in fact, be the industrialization of avoidance. Jean-Paul Sartre, existentialist and chronic dissector of human freedom, insisted that man is condemned to be free. We cannot escape responsibility for the meanings we create, yet we constantly flee from that responsibility into distraction. Addiction becomes a refusal of consciousness, a flight from the unbearable weight of choice. When life feels absurd, a fix offers temporary order. Drink, inject, scroll, repeat. The ritual provides the illusion of meaning where none seems available. Viktor Frankl, surviving the concentration camps, understood the inverse. That meaning itself can outlast suffering. Those who have a why can bear almost anyhow. The addict's tragedy is not lack of willpower, but loss of why. Without a sense of purpose anchored in connection, to self, to others, to something sacred, pain becomes senseless, and the quickest relief feels like salvation. Until the inner void is met with meaning, the mind will keep feeding it with substitutes. Now step back and see how these threads weave into one pattern, a society that raises people to be productive rather than present, successful rather than whole, distracted rather than alive. When emotional wounds are pathologized instead of understood, individuals are medicated for what culture itself inflicts. Stress, isolation, and performance anxiety become normal. Compassion becomes a seminar topic. The environment itself becomes addictive, designed to keep us consuming, scrolling, buying, competing. Gabor Maté calls this a culture of disconnection. Here lies the hidden problem. Addiction is not confined to the individual. It is a mirror of collective trauma. The modern world prizes detachment, the stiff upper lip, the curated feed, the illusion of control. Yet beneath that polished surface simmers an epidemic of emptiness. People chase stimulation because silence exposes the truth. They have lost contact with their own feelings. They no longer trust rest. They fear stillness because stillness reveals pain. The same pain their addiction promises to erase. Philosophically, this is the collapse of inwardness. The inner life, once the domain of poets, mystics, and philosophers, is now outsourced to algorithms that decide what we see, want, and fear. Psychological resilience becomes impossible when attention itself is for sale. Addiction thrives in this soil, not as rebellion but as conformity. To be constantly busy, endlessly connected, perpetually on is to be socially approved and spiritually starved. Here's the paradox. Society punishes the addict while idolizing addiction. We worship the workaholic who destroys their body for status, the influencer who trades authenticity for dopamine metrics, the consumer who never stops acquiring. We call these success stories. The heroin user is condemned only because their addiction is visible. The rest of us hide behind productivity, calling our compulsions ambition. So the hidden problem is twofold, psychological and cultural. The psyche seeks relief from pain. The culture profits from selling relief. The addict, in this sense, is not the sick one but the scapegoat, carrying the collective wound of a civilization terrified of its own emptiness. And this realization, this uncomfortable truth, is the threshold to understanding the next layer. How these invisible forces infiltrate our minds, our relationships, even our perception of freedom itself. What happens when the very air we breathe is saturated with addiction? When our technology, economy, and identity all depend on keeping us slightly unsatisfied, the consequences reach far beyond personal suffering. They shape the architecture of society, the rhythm of thought, the definition of what it means to be human, and so the story deepens, from private struggle to collective hypnosis. Now we enter the shadowed domain where invisible systems feed on human yearning. This is where addiction stops being an individual's problem and becomes civilization's mirror. Imagine walking through a city at dusk. Every window flickers with artificial light. Every screen pulses like a heartbeat. You see people hurrying, earbuds in, faces tilted down toward glowing rectangles. There is a rhythm to it, swift, synchronized, mechanical. You realize with a quiet unease that you are watching a colony of addicts in perfect coordination, each person alone together in the same trance. The objects differ, alcohol, work, status, phones, but the nervous system tells one story. I must not stop. Stopping would mean feeling, and feeling would mean remembering. Addiction is often discussed as if it happens in a vacuum, but it's not a private malfunction, it's a cultural operating system. Every advertisement, every notification, every reward loop exploits the same circuitry that once helped humans survive scarcity. What was once the neurobiology of foraging is now the psychology of compulsion. We are not broken individuals. We are finely tuned to an environment built to exploit our instincts. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter of anticipation, fires not when you receive pleasure, but when you expect it. The brain's learning systems are designed to chase prediction, not satisfaction. In ancestral times, this propelled the hunter to track food and the infant to cry for care. In the digital age, it keeps the consumer endlessly scrolling, swiping, refreshing. The slot machine and the social feed are identical twins, sharing the same code of uncertainty and intermittent reward. Gabor Maté calls this the hijacking of human attachment, our ancient longing for connection redirected toward machines that simulate it. Now imagine what this means on a societal scale. When billions of nervous systems are constantly stimulated, the collective emotional tone shifts toward agitation. Rest feels like withdrawal. Silence becomes suspicious. People start to equate being busy with being alive. Entire economies depend on this restlessness. Attention itself becomes the most valuable currency, because whoever controls your craving controls your choices. The unseen consequence is not just personal dependency, but the erosion of freedom disguised as convenience. You think you're choosing, but your desires are pre-selected. You think you're connected, but your relationships are mediated by algorithms that feed on your loneliness. You think you're informed, but outrage and novelty decide what truths you see. Addiction has scaled up from the bloodstream to the culture stream. Neuroscience describes addiction as the narrowing of the brain's reward circuitry. What once responded to a wide variety of pleasures, music, friendship, discovery, gradually focuses on a single stimulus. The same thing happens to societies. A healthy civilization draws joy from art, nature, contemplation, and community. A diseased one worships profit, productivity, and stimulation. It becomes collectively anhedonic, capable of excitement but not joy, of consumption but not fulfillment. There is also a subtler consequence. Empathy begins to collapse. When pain is stigmatized, people learn to hide it. When they hide it, they stop recognizing it in others. Compassion atrophies, replaced by moral judgment or voyeurism. The addict becomes other, a spectacle or statistic. Meanwhile, the rest of us internalize the same fragmentation. We curate identities that look whole while we feel hollow. The boundary between addiction and normality dissolves. What remains is the degree of social approval. Carl Jung warned that what we repress collectively returns as madness. The epidemic of anxiety, burnout, and loneliness is the psyche's rebellion against a system that denies depth. We medicate symptoms without listening to their message. Every panic attack, every binge, every depressive episode whispers the same sentence in different dialects. You are living in ways that contradict your nature. Consider the emotional economy of modern life. Children are taught early to perform rather than to feel. Schools reward compliance and competition over curiosity. Adults inherit the same script, measured by output, haunted by comparison. When the human soul is reduced to metrics, it seeks refuge anywhere it can. Some find it in substances, others in self-optimization, turning even healing into performance. The addiction morphs, but the logic stays. I am only valuable if I am improving. The unseen damage is existential fatigue. We are tired, not because we do too much, but because we do so little that matters. Gabor Maté writes that genuine rest is impossible when the self is at war with its own feelings. Addiction numbs that war temporarily, but never ends it. In fact, the numbness becomes the new battlefield, one where emotions die quietly and meaning evaporates without protest. Think of the environmental crisis through this lens. The planet's exhaustion mirrors our own. Both stem from the same compulsion to take more than we need, to fill an inner void with outer excess. Our consumption is psychological before it is ecological. We exploit resources the way we exploit our bodies, under the illusion that endless growth is health. Addiction is not only in the veins, it is in the highways, in the markets, in the ideology of more. There is a deeper philosophical irony here. The more we pursue freedom through choice, the more enslaved we become to the act of choosing. Jean-Paul Sartre called this the vertigo of possibility. The addict, like the modern consumer, mistakes variety for liberation. Yet true freedom, as Gabor Maté would say, is not the ability to choose your poison, but the capacity to stay present without needing one. But presence is unbearable when pain is unhealed. That is the final unseen consequence, the loss of presence itself. When you can't tolerate your inner experience, you outsource your consciousness. You live slightly ahead of yourself, always reaching, never arriving. The future becomes a refuge from the now. And in that displacement, life quietly passes by, unseen, uninhabited, half-lived. Addiction, then, is not about pleasure, but absence, the absence of connection, authenticity, and belonging. And when an entire civilization normalizes that absence, individuals begin to doubt that depth ever existed. This is why recovery, in the truest sense, is not merely abstinence. It is the remembering of what was forgotten, the stitching back together of the self torn apart by disconnection. You can begin to feel the tension gathering, the sense that something immense is waiting behind the curtain. Because if addiction is both symptom and mirror, then healing cannot mean simply avoiding the substance or deleting the app. It must mean defying the logic that made addiction necessary. It must mean rebellion, not against pleasure but against the conditions that turned pleasure into anesthesia. The next step is dangerous because it challenges the foundation of modern identity. It asks, what if breaking free requires unlearning everything society taught you about success, productivity, and even happiness? What if liberation feels at first like loss? To face that question is to enter the rebellion, the moment when awareness becomes defiance, and the addict within and the culture without are forced to meet in truth. Imagine standing at the edge of your own life, the place where you've spent years circling, numbing, negotiating with ghosts. You've tried moderation, distraction, confession, punishment. You've sworn to yourself 100 times that tomorrow will be different. But tomorrow never arrives, because tomorrow is built from the same materials as yesterday. The cycle is not just chemical or behavioral, it's metaphysical. It's the war between your false self and the fragments of truth still buried underneath. Rebellion begins when you stop asking, how do I control this? And start asking, what is this trying to tell me? That question is a key disguised as surrender. It opens a door that cannot be forced, because addiction in all its disguises is not a thing to be defeated but a message to be understood. Gabor Maté says that healing requires compassion, not control. To face the roots of addiction, you must abandon the fantasy of being fixed by willpower alone. The will that created the addiction cannot cure it. It is built on the same illusion of separateness. The rebellion, then, is paradoxical. It starts not by tightening your grip, but by loosening it. By allowing the self to feel again what it once buried alive. This kind of surrender feels like death because, in a way, it is. The death of denial, the death of false strength, the death of the persona who believed that pain was a personal failure rather than a human inheritance. Every genuine transformation demands a symbolic death. Every awakening requires the ego to burn, so something larger can breathe through the ashes. Jung called this individuation, the process of integrating the shadow, so that the fractured psyche becomes whole again. To rebel against addiction is to rebel against a civilization that taught you to flee discomfort at all costs. It is to sit, trembling inside your craving and whisper, I will not abandon myself this time. That act of staying, of presence, undoes centuries of conditioning in a single moment. You discover that the craving was never the enemy. It was your nervous system's way of saying, something needs your attention. When you meet it with curiosity instead of condemnation, the energy shifts. What once demanded relief now reveals information. Healing is not linear. It moves in spirals, revisiting old wounds under new light. You may relapse, not only into substances but into self-forgetting, overwork, emotional withdrawal. Each relapse, seen clearly, becomes data rather than defeat. You begin to decode your triggers. Loneliness, shame, unworthiness, the ache of being unseen. You learn to trace them back to origins that had nothing to do with vice and everything to do with unmet need. Slowly, compassion replaces judgment. Compassion not as pity, but as radical understanding. The same force that you once sought in bottles and screens now lives within you. Nietzsche wrote, one must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. The addict's chaos, when faced honestly, contains immense creative power. Rebellion means transmuting that energy instead of repressing it. You turn the same intensity that once chased oblivion toward creation, connection, truth. You use what once destroyed you to illuminate what was hidden. Addiction was never a mistake. It was misdirected fire. But how does one begin practically to redirect that fire? Not through moral resolve, but through meaning. Viktor Frankl's insight returns here like a compass. When you discover a why, the how becomes bearable. The question is not, how do I stop? But what is worth my presence more than this craving? Meaning is not abstract philosophy. It's relationship, purpose, contribution, love. When you commit to something larger than relief, the addiction loses its gravitational pull. The nervous system begins to trust life again. Community, too, is part of rebellion. Addiction isolates. Recovery reconnects. The ego resists help because help requires vulnerability, the very state it was built to avoid. Yet connection is the medicine that the wound was craving all along. It's no coincidence that the opposite of addiction, as Maté often notes, is not sobriety but connection. Healing is relational. You cannot do it alone because the wound itself was created in loneliness. Still, the deepest rebellion happens internally. It's the moment you refuse to measure your worth by productivity, appearance, or perfection. You begin to dismantle the internalized voice of the culture that says, "You are only as good as your output." You replace it with the quiet truth, "I am enough when I am real." That is the revolution of authenticity, the courage to be unmasked. In practice, this rebellion might look like small radical acts of self-respect, resting when the world demands hustle, saying no when you've been trained to please, feeling anger without calling it toxic, grieving what you never received instead of pretending it doesn't matter. Each act breaks the spell of addiction because it reconnects you to your own agency, the one power addiction stole by convincing you that you had none. Philosophically, this rebellion aligns with Sartre's existential freedom. To be conscious is to choose, even when circumstances seem coercive. But real choice emerges only when you are aware of the forces shaping you. The addict's awakening is existential awareness sharpened by suffering. You realize that freedom is not the absence of craving, but the ability to face craving without surrendering to it. In that space between impulse and action, you reclaim yourself. This rebellion also demands forgiveness, especially of the self. You forgive the younger you, who did not know another way to survive. You forgive the body for adapting to pain. You forgive the mind for believing its own stories. Forgiveness does not erase responsibility. It transforms it into wisdom. Each moment of forgiveness releases a fragment of energy that had been frozen in shame. That energy becomes fuel for living differently. To rebel is not to hate the system, but to stop feeding it with your unconsciousness. You withdraw your participation from the market of distraction. You become unpredictable to those who profit from your fear. You learn to sit in quiet rooms without panic. You begin to savor what cannot be bought. Slow mornings, unperformed laughter, the pulse of your own breath. You start to notice that the world looks different when you are not trying to escape. And then something astonishing happens. You realize that breaking free was never about destroying addiction, but about remembering who you were before you needed it. The rebellion reveals that beneath the cravings, beneath the pain, beneath the endless search, there was always a self untouched by chaos, a witness, a consciousness that cannot be addicted because it cannot be divided. That realization is the bridge to the final revelation, the ultimate truth that waits beyond rebellion. Because once you've dismantled the illusions of control, success and self-hatred, one question remains, glowing like an ember in the dark. If the addiction was never the enemy, and the self beyond it has always been whole, what then is freedom really made of? Imagine silence, not the shallow kind that follows noise, but the deep, ancient silence that comes when all your inner voices finally grow still. No craving, no bargaining, no self-interrogation, just a quiet recognition. You have been here before. Beneath the noise of wanting, beneath the panic of survival, this stillness has always waited. It is the space in you that addiction could never touch. The space that was never lost, only forgotten under layers of striving and fear. This is where Gabor Maté's insight lands like a revelation. Addiction is not the enemy of life. It is life's cry for connection. Every craving, every compulsion, every relapse was a misunderstood prayer, your body calling for reunion with your own aliveness. The ultimate truth is not that you must overcome addiction, but that you must understand it. Because once you understand it, it ceases to be a monster and becomes a messenger. You begin to see how your entire life was shaped by a simple misunderstanding. You thought the absence of pain was the same as happiness. You thought freedom meant being untouched by need. You thought strength meant never depending on anyone. But all of those ideas were borrowed from a culture terrified of vulnerability. You inherited an emotional philosophy built on denial, and you called it maturity. In truth, the measure of a healed person is not how little they need, but how deeply they can connect. To feel hunger without shame, to reach for help without apology, to admit I am lonely without calling it failure, these are signs of awakening. Because what you once called weakness was actually your body. Remembering the language of truth, Carl Jung might say you have descended into the underworld of the psyche and returned bearing gold, the integration of shadow and self. The parts of you that once acted out in addiction were never evil. They were neglected gods demanding worship through attention. By bringing them into consciousness, you restore the lost balance between instinct and spirit. You no longer need to exile any part of yourself. Schopenhauer would nod at the irony. Liberation was never found in denying desire, but in understanding its root. The will to live, once blind and relentless, becomes translucent when met with awareness. You still desire, but the desire no longer owns you. Pleasure transforms from anesthesia into appreciation. You taste life instead of consuming it. Nietzsche would call this the birth of the Übermensch, the self who has transmuted suffering into strength, compulsion into creation. You no longer run from pain. You sculpt it into meaning. Every scar becomes a line of poetry written in flesh. You laugh, not because life is easy, but because you finally see its tragic beauty without needing to escape it. And Sartre would remind you that with freedom comes responsibility, not the grim kind imposed by society, but the sacred responsibility of consciousness itself. You are the author now. There is no savior, no system, no chemical fix outside you. The very awareness that once tormented you with craving becomes your compass. You see that the world doesn't need to be perfect for you to be present. Presence itself is perfection enough. Here lies the paradox that breaks the cycle completely. The moment you stop trying to escape suffering, suffering loses its power to enslave you. The moment you stop chasing pleasure, pleasure stops running away. The moment you stop demanding meaning, meaning quietly returns. Addiction dissolves not through resistance, but through comprehension, like darkness yielding to a candle's single flame. Now imagine standing once more in that midnight room where the story began. The phone lies silent. The ceiling fan turns the same lazy circle. But something fundamental has changed. You don't need to reach for anything. You breathe. You feel the weight of your body, the rhythm of your heart, the pulse of existence moving through you. You realize that this raw immediacy is what you were seeking all along. The substance, the scrolling, the work, the chaos. They were all counterfeit versions of this moment. You see that the roots of addiction are not buried in moral failure or chemical seduction, but in disconnection from being itself. Once that connection is restored, the need for substitutes vanishes like mist at sunrise. The longing doesn't disappear, it evolves. What once sought oblivion now seeks union, with nature, with truth, with others, with whatever name you give the sacred. The great irony of recovery is that it doesn't make you extraordinary. It makes you human again. You rediscover simple miracles. Food tastes alive. Laughter feels unscripted. Tears fall without permission. You stop performing wellness and start experiencing life as it is. Messy, unpredictable, fleeting, but real. The same nervous system that once chased numbness now vibrates with sensitivity. You no longer fear feeling too much. You fear going back to feeling nothing. Gabor Maté often says that healing is not about becoming who you should be, but about reclaiming who you already are. That realization is both humbling and electrifying. You realize there was never a missing piece, only the illusion of separation. Addiction was the mind's clumsy attempt to bridge that illusion. Once you remember your wholeness, the bridge collapses because you are already home. The philosophical weight of this truth cannot be overstated. For centuries, thinkers have tried to define freedom as detachment, from pain, from desire, from dependency. But perhaps true freedom is radical intimacy, the willingness to feel everything and still remain open, the courage to meet existence on its own terms without flinching, to stand in the flood of reality and say, yes, look again at the world around you. The same city hums, the same screens glow, the same temptations whisper. But now you see them not as enemies, but as reminders. Each craving, each distraction, each small ache is an invitation. Come back to yourself. And every time you do, the world expands a little. as if relieved that you finally noticed it was never trying to hurt you. It was only reflecting your inner state. So the final revelation is devastatingly simple. There is nothing to fix. You are not a project. You are an unfolding. The pain was real, but so is your capacity to meet it with love. Addiction taught you to run from your own depth. Awareness teaches you to dive into it. Somewhere between those two movements lies the meaning of redemption, not a moral victory, but a return to wholeness. And when you finally see that, a strange peace settles over you. Not the sterile peace of avoidance, but the luminous quiet of understanding. The same silence that has waited beneath every craving, patient as gravity. You smile not because the journey is over, but because it never was a journey at all, only a remembering. The world continues, chaotic and beautiful. People still hurry, screens still flicker, but you at last can stand still. You breathe in the wild, unfiltered air of existence and whisper to the universe the truth it has been waiting to hear through you. I was never broken. I was only asleep.